Monster Guys present a Yokai Podcast presentation, bringing to life, through short stories and informative discussion, the strange, the beautiful, the whimsical, and the mystery of Japanese yokai.
Now please enjoy a story titled The Disappearance of Aikawa, written and narrated by C. Michael McGannon, presented by the Monster Guys. Michael, we're going to start this episode of our Yokai Tales podcast in just a little different way, because this is part one of two parts of a story.
Part one of two parts.
Indeed. So instead of having our normal discussion following the story, we've got a little preface here before the story begins, and then you'll receive part two of this story next month. And then we'll do a full-on discussion about all the elements and all the yokai that are included in the story. I will say, if you do hear any spooky sounds behind us, we're right in the midst of one of these grand Midwest thunderstorms. A lot of lightning, a lot of thunder, a lot of rain. So it's fitting for tonight's story, but it kind of is a little distracting when you're trying to record.
Yeah, I can imagine the editing is more difficult that way as well.
But anyway, the Disappearance of Aikawa, you wrote this tale not specifically about a yokai, but it's more of a story of a university professor, and it's kind of Lovecraftian. So it's kind of interesting to mix those two elements, the yokai and the Lovecraftian style of writing, of storytelling.
Yeah, and I was very nervous about doing this one, actually, and I really wanted to. I guess I was nervous leading up to you reading this story because Lovecraft was sometimes criticized about certain styles that he wrote in, and I chose to go with one of those styles. It was a little bit risky, but I think it paid off. Specifically, though, the inspiration I had for this story was just a single scene in my head, which you'll see here toward the end of this particular part of the story, that seemed very lonesome and yet at the same time claustrophobic for the main character. Something that was impossible to really survive without help as a human being. So it's something that I was really excited to get into. The idea of throwing yokai into something Lovecraft themed is just, well, it's mixing two of my favorite things. So
well, and I think they fit well together overall, and not just in this story, but I think overall in the genre and in the culture. Those two things fit well if they're put together and written well. And this is an interesting story. And like I said, this is part one of two. So you'll get this part this month. And there's a bit of a cliffhanger. We're not going to reveal who it is at the cliffhanger. Some yokai enthusiasts will probably be able to figure it out, and some won't. But we're just going to leave it a mystery leading into next month's part two, where there'll be more yokai and a whole lot more that unravels for this human. But there is one yokai that's prominently featured in this story. There are a few that are referenced, but talk to us about that one that's kind of prominent throughout the end of the story here.
Well, that's the Gashadokuro. It is a bizarre yokai. It's one of the first yokai I remember actually reading about as a teenager. And there's not really a whole lot to go on. It's not like they have a lot of stories that center around the Gashadokuro, but he shows up here and there throughout folklore. But this is a 50-foot tall skeleton.
Pretty tall.
Pretty tall. You know, a lot of yokai just show up and scare the living crap out of people and then disappear. Or they make bizarre noises and then they disappear. They seem to come and go, and maybe they'll cause a fever or some strange illness or something like that, and then you'll be fine. Not so much with this guy. Being a giant and being much bigger than any living human, he does tend to eat people. So there's that.
Which is one of the primary features of this yokai, that he eats humans.
Yeah, and they describe him as being a cannibal because this yokai is actually made from the bones of people who die on the battlefield. So if you can imagine how many bones it would take to make a 50-foot skeleton, that's the type of battle that we're talking about, and that's the type of rage and evil that encompasses this yokai.
Kind of reminds me of a yokai version of the Necrogolem that we wrote about in our young adult fantasy series a few years ago, even though he was made from the Sluagh, the Irish fairy spirits.
Yeah, and in our story, he was summoned, or it was created by a witch.
Yeah.
It's funny that I didn't even think about that. It's funny that you mentioned that because the Gashadokuro is featured in one old story about a frog witch, or a witch that used a lot of frog magic, and she summoned this thing to wreak havoc through a castle once. So that's funny that you mentioned that.
Another feature of this yokai is it's known to cause a ringing in the ears.
It is, and I've never seen an explanation for that. Like I said, this was one of the first yokai that I came across, and to this day, it's still one that's fairly mysterious to me. It seems to just come and go and disappear as it pleases and wander around. You know, it talks about how these things wander the countryside, and I don't know if you're traveling the Japanese countryside back then, I don't know how you miss a 50-foot skeleton wandering around. It talks about how when they're nearby, you hear a ringing in your ears. So, I'm not sure how you would really get close enough to that big of a creature to hear the ringing in your ears. Or maybe this is heard miles away, I'm not sure. But it's just kind of a weird, unexplained feature of this monster.
Which is kind of cool. It's not as well known as other yokai. And to me, it's kind of cool because as dangerous and threatening and powerful as this yokai is, it also seems just to kind of be out for a stroll. It seems very leisurely about what it's out doing, and so it's very nonchalant. And as far as the story that we're reading here today and some of the writing surrounding this yokai, but it's just kind of cool to me, something so big and so massive and dangerous, yet just going for a stroll through the woods.
Yeah, it is a bizarre, to me it's still a bizarre mystery, and I think that's why I actually imagined this specific yokai in that final scene that I was talking about that, you know, was the original concept for the story. So I think that it was fitting because they're just weird and strange.
And this is a story about a professor who is coming to terms with his beliefs and his convictions about the stories of old. And it's something I think we'll touch on more in our discussion next month, but I believe it's part of our human condition and one of the things that we wrestle with. So we tackle that through story here. There are references to the afterlife and hell and demon yokai and many other things in here that all play into the bigger picture of the larger story. But we'll leave that for next month because the story's not done yet.
So is it time to begin?
Let's begin the story, The Disappearance of Aikawa.
Mine is the realm of history, too fantastic to believe. Myths and legends honored by culture and the history books, but told to children when they are young, or shared on the internet with those looking for an interesting story. My colleagues collect these stories like captured insects to pin to their walls, sharing tales with careful accuracy, like one might point out the shiny carapace of a collected beetle, or the well-preserved wings of a beautiful Rhopalocera specimen pinned and framed on a wall. Few of my colleagues, if any really, believe that the stories they tell actually took place, at least not in the way that the stories are told. They pass it off as a fairy tale, even when our history is so entwined with these so-called fairy tales. How wrong they are to think in such a way. I've always believed the old legends to be true. Yes, there are discrepancies in the old stories, regional variations in folklore, as one would expect. Is it all that discrediting, however, when you also take into account how often the history books of the world are rewritten? Folklore is plagued by those religious and political groups who wish to spin old cultures one way or another, but perhaps it is more honest due to the very fact that it is overlooked and discredited as a whole. It was this very line of thought that I let slip out during one of my lectures at the Tokyo University I spent the majority of my career at. What was it, 7 weeks ago? More? Less? It feels like a lifetime has raced past since then. Aikawa-sensei, are you saying that you believe these myths are true? One of my then students asked, her eyebrows knitted together, looking at me as if I was suddenly no longer a seasoned professor of the university, but a quack author of some urban legend compendium. I chose my answer carefully. Of course they are true, somewhat. You are all familiar with the legend regarding Sutoku. Several faces throughout my crowded lecture hall held recognition, while others fell flat. I sighed. Sutoku Tenno, the young emperor, politically maneuvered from his throne and exiled from the palace. Finally, most of them seemed to remember the name. As you know, or as you should know if you've ended up in my classroom, after being exiled, Sutoku chose to live out his life as a monk, copying over sacred texts, many of which he tried to send back to the court. Fearing that he resented them for his political removal, the court believed that he had cursed the texts, and so they rejected them. This is history, this is known. However, the young woman continued, it is said that he became angry after the rejection, and that when he died, he became a yurei. Not just a yurei, I corrected, an onro, some say, or maybe even a tengu. The young woman spoke up again, and many believe the downfall of the court, the natural disasters, and the wars that followed for centuries were because of a curse left behind by Sutoku. I remember grimacing at the student's wording. She was mostly correct, if a little inaccurate as to the nature of what onryo and tengu were. Neither were curses, so to speak. She kept on. But Aikawa-sensei, you believe this as well. The legend of him becoming some sort of monster after death and causing all of those events to happen? The hall grew silent, and I was suddenly aware of how intent every face looked upon me. I had made a respectable name throughout the years. In my field of academic work, my opinion was well respected. I looked across the sea of eyes upon me, some old, many young. They were waiting for an answer. Was it hubris? At the time, I believed that some of them looked upon me waiting for guidance, as if my professional opinion would allow them to believe as well. Yes, I do believe these things. I waited. Silent. There are too many events in history. Someone began whispering at the top of the lecture hall. Too many documented happenings. Feet shuffled somewhere to my right. That we should discount them as mere mythology. As I finished my statement, I could feel it. A shift in the air in the room, a different gleam in the eyes of my students. And for those eyes that did not mock me, there was disappointment. I sighed, internally cursing my moment of naivety. Of course they would think me some crackpot. Theirs had not been a lifelong study of history such as mine. What could they know or fully appreciate? Straightening my shoulders, I moved on with my lecture, changing topics and ignoring the incredulous looks around me. After the lecture, I headed for the staff's lounge, as I usually do before going back to my office. My coffee maker had been out of order for months at that point, and I did not have the time to replace it. Besides, the machine in the lounge was admittedly better at making a drinkable version of the liquid than I was. So by the time I reached my office, someone stood there waiting for me. A fellow professor of history, Professor Terada, stood admiring my office's view of the city. He turned and smiled when I came in. Terada, it is good to see you. Well, I hope? More than well. Terada laughed, and I heard something within his laugh. Was it nervousness? A hint of question building? Aikawa, I heard something interesting today. Oh? Yes. Do you truly believe the old stories we study are true? I took the effort to avoid stiffening. Had my admittance spread so far, so fast? When I did not answer for an extended period of time, Terada continued. I am sorry, I didn't mean... No, it's fine. Yes, I do. It is something that I have become more and more convinced of over the years. Terada tried to maintain his polite and friendly smile. But, Aikawa, don't you think we would have found evidence? More evidence than just stories recorded and re-recorded over the centuries, millennia even. Then what do you propose? How do you explain the head of Taira no Masakado coming to life every night, then flying away of its own accord? Terada shook his head. Propaganda from those who were unhappy with the imperial court's decision to have him beheaded. Perhaps someone stole the head and dropped it off in Edo. And the fact that it did not decay for so long there on that pike? Again, Aikawa, propaganda. What if it did decay, and history just chose to record the more fanciful rumors of the time? Humph, the history books are written by the victorious. Taira no Masakado was by no means victorious at the end of the day. All right, and what of Tamamo no Mai? Terada's eyebrows lifted. My colleague looked more concerned than shocked. The nine-tailed fox. All that's left are tales of her vile nature, and the stone she supposedly turned into upon death. A stone, I might add, that was once believed to kill anyone it touched. Science has shown us that the area is simply a toxic place. Dangerous for anyone to be near, really. Yes, it is a dangerous enough place. How is that not a measure of truth to the old legend? Aikawa, every legend has a measure of truth to it. That does not mean the fantastic details are all true. Answer me this. If what you're saying is true, why is it that you don't see the miracles of old still happen in our modern world? I left the university that day downtrodden. Of course, I had considered Terada's opinions. They were the opinions of my industry. One would be foolhardy not to consider the possibility that he was right. However, I had considered those possibilities for many years, and knew them to be false. Why was it that the miracles of old were absent today? People simply weren't looking in the right place. I was now the quack of the university, or if I was not then, I knew it would only be a matter of time. What people needed was proof, and I was going to be the one to find it. Yamotsu Hirosaka, the entrance to the netherworld, lay toward the middle of Japan, not far from Matsue. It is fairly accessible for being a gateway to the afterlife. I packed a small case of luggage and made the trip the very next day, forgoing my scheduled lectures. Of course, I left a note of absence, saying that there was an emergency I had to attend to. In a way, it was true. The burning question of my entire career, no, my entire life, could no longer be left unanswered. Having left early, I reached Matsue while it was still morning. It was a bright and sunny day, and many people were out along the streets and roads enjoying the weather. Their happy faces only deepened my desire to reveal the truth to the world. After what seemed an eternity, I reached my destination and parked my car not far from Yamotsu Hirosaka. Much of this area had been turned into a park of sorts, with different points of interest, including a shrine for the creator god, Izanagi. I was not here for him, however. In all honesty, I did not know how exactly I would find the entrance to the Land of Darkness. This place was something of a tourist location, frequented by human traffic often. My faith in the horrors and legends of old held fast, however. Those who visited this place did not actually believe they would find the road to hell so easily. The wooded area was gloomy and quiet. It was appropriate for my state of mind at the time. However, the gravity of the sacred mission I found myself on faltered a bit as I passed the cartoonish plaques and signs explaining the importance of the site to visitors. I ignored them, continuing on. Finally, I reached the 3 boulders clumped together in the wood. Many believed it was one of these boulders that Izanagi used to seal the netherworld after being chased by his dead, rotting wife, Izanami. As many others have experienced over the years, the hairs on my arms stood among sudden gooseflesh as I looked upon the historic location. Slowly, respectfully, my mind began wandering through the different ways to cross over through the underworld. I inspected the 3 boulders. As was to be expected, they were solidly set into the ground. I did not truly wish to move them anyway. While I believed traveling between the realms was possible, the place had been sealed for a reason, and I did not wish to break such a thing. Choosing a secluded copse of trees not too far away, I sat down and took out the box of lunch I had prepared. I could still view the majority of Yamotsu Hirosaka without being easily seen, and I was prepared to wait for most of the day until the right moment. At one point, a pair of sightseers came through the area, looking around at the boulders and the nearby marker stones with what I imagined was reverence, until they began to laugh and point and make jokes to each other at the informational plaques. I sighed. They were just like Terada, feeling the truth, knowing of it, but not believing. I watched the woman rub her arms nervously once. Not long after, they seemed to leave in a hurry. Even in their mocking lack of understanding, they must have known deep within. This was not a place to point and laugh. I smiled a little. After a time, the sun began to dip, the heavily wooded area already having felt the late shade for some time now. I waited patiently. In my studies of history and folklore, and thanks to my standing with the academic community, I had been able to lay eyes on many texts over the years. A few of those manuscripts dealt with rituals surrounding times and locations. What I was about to attempt would be a novice act, as I had never done anything like this before, but I was sure I knew enough to get by. This had to work. I thought of the day before, of how quickly Tarada came to me after my foolish slip of the tongue in the lecture hall. How quickly would word reach the rest of the university staff, and then beyond the university? At the same time, I took a measure of comfort in knowing that my mistake had led me here. I would prove that I was right if it were the death of me. I was determined. How little did I consider the weight of those thoughts at the time. I will not bore you with what efforts I took, nor will I endanger your life with the exact details of what I did, for those of you who share my feelings on the nature of our world. If this account is ever found, or if it reaches more than one set of eyes, no doubt there are some who would try and follow in my footsteps. I tell you this now, do not do it. My warning aside, I will tell you a little of the frustration I experienced that night. I waited until the hour of the rat to perform my first ritual. The day had grown long and weary for me. It is odd how sitting in a single location for the majority of a day can be so draining. Perhaps my growing impatience had been a factor in it all. Feelings of dread and the occasional terror came in waves as the rat approached. It grew harder to sit by and wait. I was glad when the time had finally come. As I said, I will not bore you with details of old magic. Suffice it to say, however, with my scrolls written as I kneeled before the 3 boulders, that nothing happened. I failed. Even so, I waited a while to be sure until the silence and monotony made it clear. So I waited for another hour and a half to try again. The hour of the ox was next. I was loath to try this next ritual, as it dealt with the power of demons. But as I had pledged to myself before, I would prove that I was correct even if it caused my death. The midnight air was cold, and yet I began to sweat in anticipation. The hour of the ox came. I scribbled out the appropriate characters upon my scroll's paper, whispering the words that I dreaded. And still nothing happened. I waited and waited. After all, magic was always shown to be a tricky thing in the old stories, its exact nature known only to a handful. Perhaps something would happen as long as I kept my faith. Try as I might wish the solution or event into existence, I was merely presented with the same stagnant, unmoving boulders, the same empty night air. I looked at my watch, even the glowing hands difficult to make out in the rife darkness. The hour of the ox passed, and I cursed, throwing my pen away from me in frustration. Standing quickly, my legs quickly regretting fast movements after being still for so long, I walked up to the 3 giant stones and leaned on them, eventually pushing with all of my weight. They did not budge, of course, and I only felt more of a fool as I collapsed against the middle one. Perhaps this was not the true entrance to the underworld, I thought. After all, there were different hells, different afterlives. Where I stood was supposed to lead to Yomi no Kuni, but there was also Jigoku, with all of its different levels of horror. Perhaps they are truly connected, and there was another way to access them. I wandered beyond the boulders, walking deeper into the woods. The trees looked bigger than they had before. I attributed it to my tired mind. I thought about turning back, going to my car, and driving home this late at night. A hotel room was also an option. The thoughts infuriated me, however. I came here for a purpose, and I had been unable to fulfill it. My thoughts broke off as I realized the grassy terrain beneath me had turned harder, rockier. I looked up, seeing the moon higher than I recalled it being moments ago. Hadn't it already begun its descent a few hours ago? And had it been so large earlier this night? Before I could think very much longer, a skull-splitting ringing pierced my ears, and the earth rumbled softly. I grasped the sides of my head, palms over my ears to try and dispel the painful ringing. It did not go away. Still, the earth rumbled again, and I looked around me to find the source. As I looked around, however, I realized I was no longer at Yamotsu Hirasaka. I could still see the boulders, yes, but the landscape around me had changed completely. I didn't have much time to study it. The rumbling grew nearly as unbearable as the ringing, and a giant form crashed through the nearby treetops. My heart beat within my chest, threatening, it felt, to break its way from my ribs. I fell back against the tree, clutching the bark, my pained ears momentarily forgotten as I struggled to get a visual hold on whatever it was moving through the forest. I saw solid flashes of dirty white through the leaves and branches, but it moved too much for my eyes to understand. As quickly as it had passed, the shape began to grow distant, moving away from me. No! This was it! This was the proof I needed. I jumped up, trying once more to reduce the ringing in my head, and ran after the shape. It was difficult. Whatever this thing was, its strides were long, covering great distances in what took me much longer periods of broken and less than athletic sprinting. I quickly lost my breath, my vision unfocused. So determined to catch up was I, that I didn't consider what would happen if I actually did catch up. Running as fast as my clumsy legs allowed, I found myself within mere yards of the thing now, my heart thumping, mind racing. What was this miraculous thing that stood before me? That it was a skeletal foot and leg came to my frenzied mind first. That the leg alone reached high up into the branches. That much I understood secondly. And then realization hit me. It had stopped, and now it was bending, kneeling. My excitement turned to fear as the knee came down, and I saw that it was no longer facing away from me, but had turned a little. The trees bent and swayed like tall grass, giving way to the giant. Huge, bony fingers slammed into the earth, bracing as the thing brought itself lower and lower to the ground. It then breached the ribcage, massive, the bones white but dirty. And then, what I grew to expect, huge teeth and mandibles of the being's jaw. I ducked behind a tree before the entire skull came down to ground level, gritting my teeth as the ringing grew louder, nearly causing my head to numb behind my eye sockets. Had I been too loud in my running? Had this thing sensed me following it? Any other questions forming in my mind were abruptly cut off by several large crashes. I could barely ask myself what was happening before a violent gust of wind and a rushing sound passed the tree I hid behind. More crashing, tremors, and a jarring of the earth commenced. It registered that the skeletal arm had reached beyond my tree, and I watched as the huge bony fingers, looking as calcified claws might, searched the earth, wrapping around trees, patting the ground. It was looking for me. A whimper escaped my lips, and I spared a hand from my ears to cover my mouth. The giant skeletal fingers stopped their prodding of the earth, slowly dragging themselves into a fist. They seemed to shake as they did, leaving rivets in the ground. I could see in the trembling of the bones, small perhaps, but large to my eyes, that this being, whatever it was angry. The fist propped itself against the ground, and in the absence of crashing violence, I heard instead the creak of bones as the creature moved. Creature. Giant skeleton. My mind searched through years of research to remember anything useful. I was, however, a little distracted. I heard the slow rush of wind before I saw the cause. The giant skull, its horrible chin and teeth chattering loudly, pushed forward, beyond the safe haven that was the single tree I pressed against. The ringing was torturous, and I stumbled away from the skull as I became sick to my stomach from the pain. Thankfully, I had fallen to my knees around the tree, so I still could not see the giant's face, and, incidentally, it could not see me. I was able to see the rest of its body now, noting how the dirty bones seemed to be disproportionate to what a human skeleton should look like. The bones were more pronounced, larger in some areas, as if compensating for not having any flesh or organs or blood. They also seemed to be uneven in places, as if roughly hewn or put together by something. Unable to find its pursuer, or so I believed, the being stood up again, creating a whole new set of rumbles and shakes. It disappeared into the treetops and started walking, quickly disappearing from view. I let it do so without any argument from me. After a while, my ears stopped ringing, and I knew what the being was. Gashadokuro. A giant skeleton, known for eating humans and causing a ringing in the ears. Not for the first time in 2 days, I cursed myself for being a fool. The old legends were true. That meant the monsters of old were true as well. However, as the pain in my head subsided, I rolled over onto my back and allowed elation to slowly wash over me. I had done it. I had seen the existence of a Gashadokuro with my own eyes. I had proven that the folklore I had devoted my life to was not just written and oral tradition. But I knew I needed more than that for the ignorant people of the world like Terada to believe me. Bracing myself, I stood up and looked in the direction of the Gashadokuro had wandered. I looked for the moon or the stars but saw none, unsure if the trees blocked my view or if they just weren't there. Afraid, and yet with a new purpose, I started walking. This old forest was thick, and I wondered what other monsters lurked in the shadows. It didn't matter. I would have to find my way back to Yomotsu Hirasaka at some point. Wandering around in this forest, at least I had a direction to go. It wasn't long before I saw the tree line clear ahead of me, though it was difficult to see what lay in the clearing ahead. I kept going and stepped forward from the trees, finding myself looking at the most beautiful mountains I had ever seen. As someone who traveled far and often, these mountains were different than anything I had seen before. They shimmered with the light of a moon that was still invisible in the sky, and I wondered for a second what realm I had truly wandered into. At the top of one mountain was a structure. My mind searched for its shape to identify it. It was built like an old feudal-era Japanese castle, but bigger and grander than any I had seen before. It was warmly lit, even from this distance, welcoming me to it. I had not realized it, but my feet had already started walking before I could consider whether or not approaching such a place was a good idea. As I tried to retain my ability to think rationally, my ears began ringing again, and I heard a crash from the forest. I turned to look behind me and saw, to my horror, a Gashadokuro standing there in full glory. The black holes in its skull pierced me to the soul, as if we were truly face to face, eye to eye, and not a heady distance away from each other. In my heart, I knew it could close that distance in seconds if it so wished. Still, my mortality took hold of me, and I turned to run. But there in the mountains, I saw two more giant figures, also Gashadokuro. The ringing in my head remained faint, but grew more potent. And then, in my peripheral, I saw another Gashadokuro to my left, and another miles away on my right. A free hand clutched at my chest. Would this be my fate, to discover the truth and be eaten by these giant cannibal spirits? You are not from my time. The voice drifted down to me, and I looked up to see a woman hovering in the air. Her eyes glowed with malice, and her long red nails curled in the air toward me. Her skin was sickly green like that of a frog. I knew in that moment I would rather die at the hands of the giant skeletons than face her. Defying the inevitable fate that lay all around me, I ducked beneath her hovering figure, running as fast as I could for the castle in the mountains.
As always, you can find us at themonsterguys.com, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just look up The Monster Guys. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to part 2 of The Disappearance of Aikawa next month on our Yokai Tales Podcast, presented by The Monster Guys. Good night.